Can you hear me now? Okay, good. No. Smile and nod. No. By the way, it is okay to participate. It's okay to smile, nod, clap, say amen, it's okay. We often joke that, if y'all don't get more lively out here, we're going to have to get either some cue cards or something, hold them up, applause now, say hallelujah now, put it down. My theory was, we could even go a little bit more radical and, maybe hot wire some seats or something, really get some people excited, but some people thought that might be a bad idea. So today's going to be a test, so kind of get involved, be a part of this. If not, we'll get some cue cards next week. How many of you came today expecting to hear a sent word from Yahweh? Amen? See, it's better. See how much of it you're already doing better. You're passing. We're good. No. I came as well expecting to hear that. Amen? I found that if we would come with that expectation, if we would come understanding that the words that we hear today, that it's not me, it's not David, it's not whoever's standing behind the podium, but it's something that's coming from Yahweh, then we listen to it differently, won't we? We'll pay it a different form of respect, a little bit different form of attention. And I found that if we'll understand that what he's speaking forth is a sent word, then we'll know that no matter what circumstances we may be in, how many of you have been going through maybe some tough times? Maybe you've been in the midst of a battle, some things have been going on, everything's not really peachy keen. Well, I found that when you come and he delivers a sent word, that it becomes shot straight like an arrow. And it delivers to that situation, whatever you may be going through, whatever may not be on par, whatever your circumstances may be, that word then has the power to change those circumstances. Isn't that powerful? That word has the potential to take something that the enemy meant for evil, meant for bad, meant to destroy you, and he can change it. And all of a sudden, everything that looked like was lost is now, all of a sudden, it's worked out for your benefit. Isn't that powerful? Today we're going to take a look at this week's Torah portion. It's titled Teitzei. And if any of you have read this portion, those that I talked to that did read it, it was a little bit more difficult portion, wasn't it? It's one of those, there's a few throughout the year that you bump into that are kind of like, it's one of those again. And so I found that, when we run across one like this, and it seems from the surface that maybe, what's going on in this portion? It seems to be jumping from one subject to the next, that there's something here, and that if we're not careful, we'll miss it. But if we'll do like 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 15 tells us, and we'll study to show ourselves approved, then you'll find there's an unspeakable treasure that's hidden right here in this portion. It's titled as When You Go Out. And it covers Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 10 to chapter 25, verse 19. And as we've already said, it seems like quite a jumbled parsha from the surface, because did you realize that out of all the Torah portions, all the ones of the year, this one actually contains the most commandments that's listed in one spot? There's 613 total, and 74 of those different commandments are jam-packed into this one Torah portion. And so you can see that it's quite a fast rocket ride, isn't it, when you read through this, because there's no time. It's one after another. He's laying it out. He's listing them. And so it can be hard at first to see what's the thought, what's that theme that's running through this portion, what's he trying to convey to us, what's that sent word that we came to hear. And I found that if we're going to be able to understand what's happening in this portion, we really have to understand how we're going to view this. And in the past, for those of us that have come out of that Christian background, before these laws, these commandments, they were antiquated, weren't they? They were bondage. Ooh, you don't want to go back under the law. But now for those of us that have come to this new understanding, we understand these are actually terms of the covenant, aren't they? These are important. These commandments, as we begin to look through them, they're actually something that will define and set the boundaries for our relationship with Yahweh. Did you realize that? This defines that relationship that we have with him. It's the guidelines that if we want to stay right next to the tabernacle, if we want to stay in this level of friendship and intimacy that we have with him, then we've got to abide by these commandments, because this is the covenant. This is what we've agreed to do. And so I found then that if there's so many listed here in this Torah portion, all right here together, then it seems that it might be a really important part of this legal document, wouldn't it? It seems like it might be important for us to pay attention to it, because we're signing this line. We're agreeing to these terms, but a lot of times we skim right over it, don't we? We really don't pay attention. Have you read some of these laws in here? Some of these can seem as if, well, how in the world does that apply to me? How does that apply to you and I today? And in fact, as I began to look at it from this standpoint, these are something that define our relationship with Yahweh, you immediately run into a dilemma. Because the very first commandments that begin to be listed, we now understand that all of these are defining our relationship with Him. The very first ones are some commandments that seem as if it really doesn't apply to us today, or it would apply to a very small, minute group of people. Because the first commandment deals with the laws concerning the beautiful captive, is what it's referred to as. And it deals with Israel when they would go to war. If the soldiers saw a woman that was taken among the captives and they wanted her to make her their wife, the rules regarding that. And so from the beginning you may think, well, what in the world does that have to do with my relationship with Yahweh? Because we've already stated these commandments, they're the boundary lines. They're what will define our relationship with Him. And we're immediately faced with something that it can seem at first quite difficult to put that into perspective with this. And yet we have to understand there's something here. He didn't just put this here arbitrarily. He didn't just drop it here. It wasn't just for the children of Israel thousands of years ago when they would go to war, but it's just as important for you and I today. And so that requires us to do a little digging then, doesn't it? Because from the surface, it really doesn't make that much sense. And I found that as you begin to look at this, and that's what we're going to do, that by the end of this, hopefully, you'll see this the way he showed it to me as well, that this commandments, these verses that are dealing here with this captive woman, the one that the Israelites would go to war and they find her, that it's literally becoming this physical example where Yahweh's teaching Israel of their own redemption plan. When you begin to look at this, I want you to look at it a little differently. Look at it from the perspective that as he begins to speak these words to the children of Israel, he's literally telling them their own story. You realize they just came out of Egypt. They were this woman. They were this captive woman, enslaved, part of another nation. And he went to war for them. And we find that he sees her among the captives, and he desires to make her his own. But guess what? There's a process she's got to go through, isn't there? There's some things that have to be taken care of before this relationship they can become one. The tongue's getting tangled. And so we find that just as these laws are beginning to be laid out, he's laying out the legal parameters of why you can be redeemed. Isn't that amazing? Did you realize that everything that he does, he has to abide by his own rules? These laws aren't just for you and I, but he himself chooses to be governed by them. So whatever he does in your life, however he chooses to manifest himself or to move on your behalf, it has to fall within these covenant parameters. He has to follow the rules. How good of a judge is he if he throws out the rule book as well and chooses to not abide by it? And so I found that there's some very powerful things that are taking place here in this portion, because he's actually laying that legal framework of why you and I can be redeemed. And a lot of us think that we know what it means to be set free. We think that we understand what it means to be redeemed because we've accepted Yeshua as our Messiah and we know that we've been bought with a price. But I found that a lot of us, the majority of believers, we still walk around with that slave mentality, don't we? In our minds, we still are in bondage. We still haven't changed or renewed that. And so I found that if we really don't understand our rights, if we really don't understand the benefits that we're being given in this covenant, then we'll continue with that slave mentality. We'll continue to think that we're in bondage in Egypt, and we won't be truly set free until we begin to learn what it means to be redeemed. Until we learn what it means, what these rights are, what your legal rights are when you enter into covenant with him. And that's exactly what this portion begins to cover. It's teaching this captive woman, the one that's been in bondage, who's now being set free. It's teaching her she has legal rights. There's a certain way that she's going to be treated because that's the law. And so we find here for you and I, he's laying it out. This is the way you're going to be treated. These are your rights. Well, how many of you realize that if we don't know our rights, that if someone takes them away and tries to abuse us, we won't know the difference, will we? Are you beginning to see why it's so important that we understand this? If you'll turn with me to Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 10, we're going to take a look here at these verses, at these commandments that start off this portion, ki Teitzei, when you go out. And in verse 10, he begins to speak. It says, when thou goest forth to war against thine enemies, and Yahweh the Elohim hath delivered them into thine hands, and thou hast taken them captive, And seest among the captives a beautiful woman, and hast a desire unto her, that thou wouldest have her to thy wife, then thou shalt bring her home to thine house, and she shall shave her head and pare her nails. And she shall put the raiment of her captivity from off her, and shall remain in thine house, and bewail her father and her mother a full month, and after that thou shalt go in unto her, and be her husband, and she shall be thy wife. And it shall be, if thou shalt have no delight in her, then thou shalt let her go whither she will, but you shall not sell her at all for money. You shall not make merchandise of her, because you have humbled her. And as we've already stated, from the natural, this seems like something that really doesn't apply to us today. The majority of us are not going to be found in this situation. But now we're beginning to understand there's something more here than meets the eye, isn't there? And so we're going to begin to break this down in the Hebrew, and we're going to look and see, how does this apply to you and I? How is Yahweh reminding Israel of this redemption plan, of what he's going to do to bring them out of Egypt, to bring them out of captivity? Well, first we're going to look at that word for when. It's in the title of this portion. It's a phrase. When you go out. The word for when is ki. Say that with me. Ki. See, look, you're speaking Hebrew, and you thought you couldn't. See how easy it is? It's Strong's number 3588, and it means when, on this account, because. It functions as a time or a condition indicator. In other words, when you look at this word ki in the Hebrew, meaning when, it literally begins the statement saying because of, or on account of, this particular commandment that's about to follow. So it's calling your attention to this. Because of this commandment, something else is possible. On account of this commandment that's being stated right here, there's a specific effect. There's a specific outcome that's going to be achieved, and it has everything to do because this has been stated. It's been put into the commandments. It's been put into the contract. If we look a little bit further, you'll find that the numerical value of this word ki, it equals 30. Because you have the kaf, which equals 20, and the yod equals 10. Well, 30 is the same value as the Hebrew word achava. This word means a declaration. But specifically, it refers to the explanation of a riddle, the answer to an enigma. And when I saw this, I thought, well, this is quite interesting, because he's beginning to give us some clues, some puzzle pieces, if you will. And we find that there's something to do with these commandments. There's something to do with this portion right here that's an answer to a mystery. How many of you like puzzles? How many of you like mysteries? Well, he's beginning to whet your appetite, because we find he's letting you know there's a mystery, there's an enigma, there's something that seems as if it's unsolvable, but I'm giving you the answer right here. If you continue to look, you'll find that value 30 is associated with the Hebrew letter lamed. The letter lamed means to teach, to instruct. It can mean to lead or to goad towards something, to prod someone. A lot of us spend a lot of time doing that, don't we? We like to prod and poke, to goad one another. Well, here we find that Yahweh's literally goading and prodding Israel to what's being laid out right here. He's provoking them to look, because there's some teachings and instructions that are very important to them. This is about them. This is about their relationship with him. If we continue to look, then we find that it seems as if what's about to happen here is that he's about to explain and teach us concerning an enigma, concerning a riddle. Well, before we can know the answer, we have to know, well, what's the riddle about? Because if we get the answer but we didn't know the problem, what good is that? We've missed the whole process. Well, if you look at that term, achava, meaning enigma or riddle, it's interesting because you can actually hear it when you pronounce it. It contains the word chava. The word chava is the Hebrew word for Eve. So literally, this enigma, this riddle, this puzzle that he's about to expound upon and explain, it has something to do with Eve. It has something to do with the bride. And we find she's the one that's being goaded. She's the one that's being prodded to look at this, to understand this mystery. But the interesting thing is that is attached to this letter, this name Chava, the word for Eve, here in this word meaning riddle, an enigma, a mystery, there's two other letters that are added. You have the letter Aleph and you have the letter Yod. The letter Aleph as a prefix, it means I will. It's a declaration. And so we find here that Yahweh's about to declare something. And in the middle of this word, meaning a riddle, an enigma, you have the letter Yod inserted. The letter Yod represents the spark, his spirit. It represents the building blocks of creation, something that gives life. And so we find here that Yahweh's actually making a statement, a declaration when we begin to read this passage that I will place my spark, my spirit, my life in Chava. I'll place my spirit in Eve. And yet we find, well, what's the problem? What's the riddle? What's the enigma? What's the problem here? And we find that when you continue to look, these two letters, this Aleph and the Yod, the interesting thing is that when you put these two letters together, they form another word in the Hebrew. The Aleph Yod forms the word meaning no, meaning not. And it infers one that's not innocent, one that's uninhabitable, one that's an unfit vessel. In fact, it comes from the root, which means it asks the question, where? It can form the question, where are they? And we find this same question being asked back in Genesis when Yahweh begins to walk through the garden and Adam and Eve have become uninhabitable. They've become an unfit vessel. They're not innocent anymore because they've eaten from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And Yahweh asks this question, where are you? And so we find here that as we continue to piece this together, it seems then that this enigma that he's about to expound on, this riddle that he's prodding us to look at and to understand, it seems to be that Yahweh has declared that I will put my Yod, I'll put my spirit in Eve, in my bride. Yet, she's not innocent. She's uninhabitable. She's an unfit vessel to carry that Yod. She's not ready. She's not pure and holy. And so we find that the question then becomes, it's almost a taunt, if you will. Where is she? Where are they? Who is this Chava? Who is this bride? The one that he's willing to put his Yod, his spirit, within. And so we find that obviously something's got to happen, doesn't it? Because Israel's just come out of Egypt. They've played the harlot. They've been unfaithful. Not one of them is fit to become his vessel. Not one of them is ready to be inhabited by his presence. And yet he's made this declaration, I'm going to put my Yod, I'm going to put my spirit in her. Well, we know that he's not a man that he should lie, and his word won't return unto him void. So what's the solution? What's about to happen here? And we find that immediately upon this, he begins to go into this passage concerning the captive woman. If you continue to look, you'll find that this word ki, when, that starts off this portion, it's a close cognate of another word in the Hebrew. It's also pronounced ki. This one is Strong's number 3587. It means branded, a branding or a burning. It can mean a burn, a mark, or a scar. But the interesting thing is that when you break it apart, you have the kaf and the yod. When? Ki. The kaf is the palm of the hands and the soles of the feet. And the yod suffix, it means my. In other words, my hands, my feet. And this word itself, it means a burning, a mark, a scar. My hands become scarred. My feet become branded, scarred, marked. In other words, we find that it seems as if he's beginning to discuss and deal with the requirements for how this woman's going to be a fit vessel. He's beginning to expound upon how she's going to be redeemed, how she's going to be set free. And we find that the requirement, it's going to require someone's hands to be marked, someone's hands to be scarred and branded, someone to pay the price. And I was reminded when I saw this immediately of Isaiah chapter 49 verse 16. It's speaking of the Messiah, and it says, Behold, I have graven thee upon the palms of my hands. Thy walls are continually before me. You realize what just happened? The price of your freedom was just named in the laying out of this covenant. When we begin to delve into this covenant language and understand that this is a legal document, the price has just been named. If you want her as your bride, if you want to redeem her, if you want to take her out of her captivity, this is the price. Your hands, your feet will be branded. They'll be scarred. They'll be marked. A price has to be paid. And if you look at this verse here in Isaiah, the first part, it makes sense to us. We understand that Yeshua was in fact scarred, marked in the palms of his hand and the soles of his feet. Your name's branded there. But yet the second statement says that thy walls are continually before me. And it really, well, what does that have to do with this sacrifice, this price that he's paying? Well, we got to break it down in the Hebrew, and you'll begin to see that he's actually explaining why he's willing to do this. The word walls in Hebrew, it's koma. It's translated as meaning a wall, but it's used as a metaphor for a beloved woman. And in fact, throughout the prophets, you'll find that continuously over and over, Israel is symbolized by a wall, but usually it's a slanted wall. She's symbolized as a slanted or a crooked wall because of her unrighteousness. Because remember, she's unfit. She's not innocent. She's played the harlot. This word comes from an unused root. It means to join. And now let's look at the second part. Your walls are continually before me. Continually is the word tamid, and it means perpetuity, to stretch, to be forever. They're forever before him. But it comes from the root, this tav mem root, which means completeness, integrity. In other words, this beloved woman, these walls are what's going to complete him. Do you realize that the Messiah is incomplete without Eve, without his bride? He's not full. He's not a full shekel. He's only half. And so we find that as we continue to look at this, it continues to seem to paint the picture that these verses here, when he begins to teach them of this captive woman and how to bring her out, how to redeem her, that it's actually dealing with Israel themselves. It's dealing with you and I. He's teaching you of your redemption process. Because just like Israel, we've been in exile too. We've been in captivity. We've been unfit. We've been adulterous and haven't been faithful. A slanted wall. One who was unrighteous. So literally, the very woman that's being spoken of in this passage, that's us. That's you and I. And yet we find that he's reminding them, but you've been engraved on the palms of my hands. And his desire is forever before him to be joined with you. You're what will complete him. Can you begin to hear the note of longing that's in this cry from the Messiah? No matter where you go, no matter what you do, continually before him is this desire to be joined with you. Continually before him is this longing to be made whole with his Isha, with his wife, with his bride. And now we can understand this becomes the enigma. This becomes the riddle. How can he take her? How can she be his wife when she's been unrighteous, when she's been unfaithful, when she's not fit to be that vessel? When she's not fit to house his spirit within her, how can they be one? Can two walk together? How can this happen? And it seems to begin to echo the thoughts of the Pharisees in the New Testament. Remember the woman that came and she washed Yeshua's feet. She was a harlot. She was a captive woman. And in Luke chapter 7, verse 39, one of the Pharisees makes a statement. It says, "Now when the Pharisee which had bidden him saw it, he spoke within himself, saying, This man," referring to the Messiah, "if he were a prophet, he would have known who and what manner of woman this is that toucheth him. For she is a sinner." She's unfit. And yet we find here, she's the one that washes his feet. Do you realize that those exact words could be said of you and I? What kind of manner of woman is this that he's willing to redeem? Who is this that's coming before him, coming to touch the Master's feet? She's been unrighteous. She's been unfaithful. And yet he's willing to redeem her. He pays the price of her freedom. In fact, after she washes his feet, he makes a statement, "Go and sin no more. You've been forgiven. You've been set free." Let's continue to look at this a little bit more. Are you beginning to see how it deals exactly with you and I? This captive woman, it's us. He's reminding you of his longing to be one with you, and he's letting you know this is the price that's been paid. It wasn't without thought. He thought this through. He knew the terms, and yet he did it anyway. Let's look at the word for goest forth. It says, when you go forth. It's the second part of the name of this portion. In Hebrew, it's the word yetzah, and it means to go out, to come out, to exit or to go forth, but it can also mean to escape, to be free. It can indicate the freeing of a slave, to go forth from captivity. Wasn't that exactly what we're talking about here? He's freeing them from their bondage. He's freeing them from slavery. They're going forth out of this captivity. But the interesting thing is that it can also describe this term yetzah. It can describe the birth and the coming out of a child. And you may think, well, what? it seems as if it might be talking about being born again. But remember, this is the Old Testament. We're in the Torah. Before, we thought only the New Testament dealt with being born again. And yet here, in the covenant terms, it's already been laid out how you could be born again, how you could be made new. And it's right here in this passage, right here in the terms of the covenant. If we look a little bit further, we find that Yetzah has a value of 101. It's the same value as the Hebrew word savah, which means to command. Savah is the root of the word mitzvot, commandments. The very things, there are 74 of them listed here. It's the mitzvot, the commandments. And so we find that as we continue to connect these dots and we continue to place these puzzle pieces together that he's giving us, it seems that the answer to this enigma, the answer to this problem, this dilemma of how he can be made one with us, it's found here in these mitzvot. It's found here right in the middle of all of these commandments. And we find that you're being reminded there is a way to be set free. No matter how deep in bondage you may think you've been, no matter how far you've been away from here, how adulterous you may have been in the past, there's a way to be set free. There's a way to free a slave, to take a captive woman and change her, so that not only is she freed from her bondage, but now she's fit to become a bride. Now she's fit to be made one with her husband. And we find that it has everything to do with this individual, the one that was willing to be scarred, the one that was willing to allow you to be marked, branded on his hands. And it seems to indicate, remember, it's also connected to these mitzvot, to these commandments. So it seems to indicate that not only is he paying this price, but there's something to do with the keeping of these commandments that also plays a role in you being set free. There's something to do with these mitzvot. They're not just given to you to make your life hard. They're not just given to you to say, oh, you can't do that, you can't do that, but we find there's a reason that it's part of your being set free. It's part of your redemption process. It's these mitzvot that literally cause you to be born again, to be made new. We find that the reason this happens is because it's these mitzvot, it's these commandments, it's the Torah that teaches you what it means to be free. And we find that when we begin to do these, when we begin to walk these out, and we're walking in covenant with Yahweh, we're keeping Torah, we're keeping the mitzvot, we're keeping the commandments, what happens is it begins to renew your mind, doesn't it? Your mind's being washed by the water of his word as you walk this out. So even though he may have paid the price and you can be free, if your mind's not renewed, guess what? You still got the slave mentality. You can't have one without the other. It requires us to walk this out. Covenant's always two parts. Each party has an obligation to do. His is that he's willing to allow his hands to be scarred. He pays the price. Your part is to walk it out. Walk out the commandments because it renews your mind. You no longer have the slave mentality. You may have been in Egypt for 430 years. You may have looked like them, talked like them, acted like them, but guess what? Your mind's being renewed now. I was reminded the way they train an elephant. David shared this before. Whenever you have a baby elephant, they'll take a chain, a heavy chain, and bind its foot, and that elephant knows this is its area. This is the only place that it can go. It can go no further because that chain is holding it. It's in bondage. It's enslaved. Well, once you change the mindset of that elephant, it understands you're in bondage, you're enslaved. You can take that chain off and just attach a slight string to it. And even though that elephant, fully grown, can break that string, guess what? It can't break the stronghold in its mind. In its mind, it's enslaved. It's in bondage. And it knows as soon as it feels a slight tug, up, I'm still enslaved. Well, how many of you realize that the enemy, the majority of us think we're in bondage with these heavy chains, but to be quite honest, because of our mindset, all it takes is a little string. Something that can be easily broken, but because we're not willing to renew our minds, because we've still got the slave mentality, that slave mindset, we stay in bondage even though it's quite simple to be broken out of it. It's just a string. And so here we find that as he begins to lay out these commandments, these mitzvot, it's all about renewing your mind. He's teaching you what it means to be free. We've been talking about the Jubilee Sukkot. We believe we're on the cusp of a Jubilee. Well, you realize that during a Jubilee, a Yovel year, if you were in captivity, you were set free. You were released. If you were enslaved, if you were in bondage, that was your year of freedom. Is it any coincidence in that he's beginning to teach us of what it means to be free? You need to understand how to renew your mind. We got to get rid of the slave mentality. If we look a little bit further, we find that this value 101, the value of Teitzei, it's also the value of one of the sons of Jacob's names, Zebulon. And at first it really won't make sense until you begin to dig into the meaning of the name of Zebulon, and then you'll understand the picture that's being associated with what it means to be free, to keep these commandments, to understand that your mind's being renewed. Because Zebulon in the Hebrew, it means exalted, but it comes from the root which means an exalted dwelling place, and it's specifically referring to the state of a relationship between a husband and wife, how they would dwell together in intimacy, and their house, their home would be an exalted dwelling place because they have one another and they're dwelling in intimacy with each other as husband and wife. And so we find in that when he attaches this name Zebulon to this whole idea of being set free, of this captive woman coming out, it's revealing to the children of Israel that it's now come full circle. Because remember, before, the question is asked, where is she? She's uninhabitable. She's unfit. She's not a proper vessel. And now we find that it's come full circle. She's went from the one that's uninhabitable, the one that isn't fit, it's not ready, she can't house his spirit within her, and now she's become the one that is epitomizing the name Zebulon, the one that's the exalted dwelling place, the one that can dwell in intimacy with her husband, with the Messiah, because it's her right. It's already been laid out. It's part of the covenant terms. It's been outlined. But if we don't understand it, we'll never achieve it because we didn't even know we could have it. And yet he's reminding us, this is the rights of you as the Isha. If you continue to look, in fact, this term here, goeth forth, is Teitzei. That's the root of it, though. But here in the Hebrew, it's actually conjugated as Teitzei. Ki Teitzei. Teitzei has the tav prefix attached to this word, Teitzei. The tav prefix in Hebrew, it means you will or she will. It adds a future tense to this verb. In other words, when he makes this statement, you will, it was revealing to us that he wasn't just talking to the children of Israel that were physically standing there hearing these words. He wasn't just talking to the generation that just came out of Egypt, that they were being set free. They were a captive woman that was now free. They were no longer in bondage. But he was also speaking to a future generation as well. You will. She will once again be set free. She will be led out of her captivity. There's a future release. There's a future jubilee. A future generation that would once again have an opportunity to be the second Eve, to be the second Chava. Now let's look a little bit further, because now we're beginning to lay this foundation. We're beginning to see that obviously this is quite important, isn't it? But if we skim over it in the English, we'll completely miss all of this. We'll miss what he's trying to teach us. He's giving us a physical shadow picture, something that we can grasp onto, something that we can relate to, so that you could understand how he views you, how he's redeeming you, how he's bringing you out. Let's look at this word for war. It says, when thou goest forth to war. The word for war in Hebrew, it's milkama, and it means battle or war, but it comes from the root lacham, and it means to fight, to do battle, to make war, but it can also mean to eat or to use as food. And in the past, we spent quite a lot of time looking at the connections between this idea of war and the word lechem, or bread. But today we're actually going to look at it a little bit differently. Because if you look at this term, milchama, the word for war, on the front of this word you have the mem, lamed, and the ket. It forms another word in the Hebrew. It's the word melach. The word melach means salt. And you may be thinking, well, what does salt have to do with us being set free? Because in our culture, we've completely lost the significance of some of these Hebraic idioms, these Hebraic shadow pictures. And we think, well, okay, well, salt, what does it have to do with anything? But when you begin to connect this into the Hebrew mindset and into this ancient treaty, we're talking about this is a covenant that's being cut, right? This is a treaty, it's a document, it's a legal framework of why you can be redeemed. Then salt begins to make sense. Because there was an ancient covenant practice, and it was called the salt covenant, that the Israelites knew quite a bit about. In fact, they were involved with one with Yahweh. And you'll find that salt was used in the ancient covenant ceremonies to seal an agreement. And so as we begin to look at this, we find that when salt comes into the picture here, it's sealing this agreement. It's making it so. Salt was important to the Israelites. Today we really don't understand the significance like they did. They understood without salt they would die from dehydration. They understood the importance of it. It was very precious to them. It was a very precious commodity. And so to enter into covenant with someone, it required you to share your salt. It was indicating that you were giving something that was very precious, very needed in your life to someone else. And so it was putting this relationship, this covenant, on a higher level, because you were giving something very precious of yourself to ratify this covenant. It symbolized trust. Therefore, when you would give someone your salt, it was a sign of your trust in that person. And so when Israel entered into a salt covenant with Yahweh, it was an indicator that their relationship with Him was going to be based on trust in Him. Well, isn't that funny? Because the whole 40 years in the wilderness, as they wander around, what's the number one thing they seem to have an issue with? They didn't trust Him. Again and again, He told them that He was going to provide for them. He was going to take care of their needs. He was going to meet their needs. And yet, again and again, we find that when they got into a situation where it immediately wasn't right there before them, instead of waiting patiently and trusting that He was going to do what He said, what did they do? They immediately began to murmur, to complain, to gripe, to grumble. What do? We're in the same boat, don't you see? Our relationship's supposed to be based on trust. But a lot of times, when things aren't going the way we want them to go, the way we think they should go, immediately our first response, instead of trusting Him, we begin to grumble, to complain, to murmur. It's no accident that whole generation gets cut off. It's because they wouldn't ratify this covenant. They wouldn't understand the importance. They'd entered into this, but now they weren't willing to keep these terms. Yet you may be wondering, what does this have to do with us being set free? This idea of the salt covenant. What does it have to do with this woman that He's taking out for a bride? Well, let's look a little bit further. We're glad you asked. Salt was used to seal a bond of friendship forever. That's something that's not really a concept today. We have acquaintances, and some friends that we do have, it seems that eventually, once you know them long enough, that relationship gets kind of rocky, doesn't it? And sometimes there's a lot of falling out. There's a lot of rifts. There's a lot of dividing, a lot of division. And yet we find that this idea of the salt covenant was that it wasn't just something that was temporary. It wasn't just for the few years. It wasn't just when you need me, we're going to be in covenant. But this was forever. In the good, the bad, the ugly, whatever was going on, this was forever. This was a covenant. There was no end. It was eternal. So entering into a covenant of salt meant that you were binding yourself to someone else, to another, in utmost loyalty and truthfulness. And the terms of this covenant required one that it was so important, they understood that it was so significant that one would even suffer death rather than break the terms of that covenant. That's a mindset that we've completely lost today. That's why divorce is so rampant. That's why treaties, covenants, relationships are so broken, because we don't understand the importance that when we enter into this, you need to count the cost. You need to understand when you choose to do this, that this is supposed to be forever. That it's so important that one would rather suffer death than break the terms of this covenant, because that's how important it is. And now you can begin to understand that if you've read this portion, after he talks about this captive woman towards the end of chapter 21, in verse 22 and 23, he throws in some other commandments that seem to be just kind of dropped in there. And it's dealing with one that if he was hung upon a tree, that he was cursed. And because we understand what the Messiah did, that he was executed upon the stake, upon the tree, we know that when we read this, well, obviously it has something to do with his sacrifice. Obviously it has something to do with the Messiah's sacrifice. But now we can understand, because we're dealing with the salt covenant. This is the whole premise of what's taking place here, of him bringing this woman out, of him making her one with him. We find that the Messiah himself understood the requirements. And rather than allow this covenant to be broken, he would rather suffer death than the covenant be undone. And so we find that we're told then, here, right here in these verses, that anyone that would hang upon a tree would be cursed. He suffers the death penalty rather than allow the covenant to be broken, rather than allow it to be undone. The word curse there is quite interesting as well. It says that this individual would be accursed. In Hebrew, it's the word kilala, and it means curse, vilification, execration. It literally means to become the object of the curse, to be something that's detested. If you're the object of the curses, it means you're the one that it's all funneling towards, aren't you? The focus is on you. So we find that what's literally being laid out for us here in the Hebrew is that when Yeshua would be executed upon the stake, upon the tree, he would become the object of the curse. All of the requirements that were upon us when we broke them, all of the punishment that rightfully was ours because we broke the terms, we didn't keep it. We left. We didn't pay attention. We didn't keep the terms of this contract, but all of a sudden now he becomes the one. He's the object. He's the one that all the focus is upon. He becomes the curse. He becomes the object of it, the one that's detested on our behalf. Well, what was the purpose of it? Well, it's right here in this word, hidden. The word kelala is spelled with the kuf lamed, lamed hey. It almost looks like a compound word. The kuf lamed forms the word kol. It means voice. The lamed hey upon the end forms the phrase to her. In other words, Yeshua becomes the one that's cursed. He suffers death rather than break the terms of this covenant that he's cut with us. And the reason is so that the kol, the voice, could speak to her again. So that Yod, his spirit, could once again be in her. Are you beginning to see the salt covenant has everything to do with you being set free? It has everything to do with why you can be redeemed, with why you can once again come into the house, because someone else paid the price, and now his voice can once again speak to you. It begins to help to answer the riddle, the enigma, that question. How can he take her? How can he become one with her? She's played the harlot. She's unfit. How can his Yod, his spirit, be placed in her? It has everything to do with the salt covenant. It's the legal parameters. It's setting the legal framework, because his redemption had to fall within the legal parameters. It had to be part of this covenant process. And we find that as we continue to look at this, you'll find that every sacrifice that was brought to the temple and to the tabernacle, guess what? Every single one of them was required to be brought and have salt. In Leviticus chapter 2, verse 13, as well as many other places, we're told that with all thine offerings thou shalt offer salt. And if we don't understand the significance of what's taking place, we've completely missed what's happening. But Israel understood it. They understood ancient covenant-cutting practices. They understood the salt covenant. They understood that when they brought salt with their offerings, when they brought salt to the temple and to the tabernacle, that they were sealing and entering into an eternal covenant with Yahweh. How long is eternal? It's forever. It doesn't end. So if we try to say, well, that's done away with, we don't have to deal with that anymore, we've just missed it completely. It's eternal. It's forever. They were entering into an eternal covenant with Yahweh. Because their offerings were brought with salt, it was an indicator that this was a salt covenant that was being cut between these two parties. And because this salt covenant was being cut, it meant that this covenant was forever. It was not going to end. Meaning that no matter what Israel did, no matter how far they might stray, no matter how unfit they might be, no matter how many times they'd go right back into the bondage he was taking them out of, he had cut a salt covenant with them. It was forever. It was eternal. There were some obligations that were going to be met. And so just like Isaiah chapter 49 verse 16 told us, thy walls are continually before me. No matter what Israel would do, how far she would stray, how often she would find herself playing the harlot again and again, the reminder would go forth, your walls are continually before me. There was a desire to be made one with her. There was a desire to once again have her, to dwell together, like Zebulon, that name, to be the exalted dwelling place. That's the reason this portion can be called Ki Teitzei, a future inference. He very well understood, talking to this generation of people, they would stray again. He'd brought them out of Egypt, but guess what? There would be a lot of other nations they would go right back to. They would go right back to the bondage that he had delivered them out of. But Ki Teitzei, a future going out, a future redemption, A future time when once again the captive woman would be set free and come out. Why? Because there was a covenant that was cut that was eternal. It was forever. It was never ending. We find that this idea of the salt covenant, it continues to expand because in the scriptures we see more references to this idea of what salt's being used for. Salt was used to rub on a newborn baby's skin to purify it. That's quite interesting because here, remember, Yitzhak can also mean to be born, a birth that's taking place, something that's being birthed. And we understand that it's dealing with the concept of being reborn, born again, made new. Well, it's interesting because salt plays a part in that. Because on a newborn baby, the salt purifies his skin. So to enter into a salt covenant was as if you were being purified. You're being made new. It's part of that being born again process. We see it being referenced in Ezekiel chapter 16, verse 4 through 6. And by the way, go back and read Ezekiel 16, because everything that's being dealt with here in Deuteronomy chapter 21, this captive woman, he continues to explain there in Ezekiel 16 of what he was going to do for this woman, of what he was going to do for his bride, the length he would go to redeem her. In Ezekiel 16, verse 4, it says, "And as for thy nativity, in the day thou wast born, thy navel was not cut, neither wast thou washed in water to supple thee. Thou wast not salted at all, nor swaddled at all. No eye pitied thee to do any of these things unto you, to have compassion upon you. But thou wast cast out in the open field to the loathing of thy person in the day thou wast born. And when I passed by thee, and I saw you polluted in your own blood, I said unto you, when thou was in your own blood, live. Yes, I said unto thee, when thou was in your own blood, live." In other words, in Ezekiel, he begins to remind Israel again of this same concept. No one else was willing to enter into this covenant with you. You've went after Egypt, you've went after Babylon, you've went after all these foreign Melachim, these foreign kings, these foreign husbands. You've been an adulterous woman, and yet not one of those was willing to enter into a salt covenant with you. Not one of those was willing to enter into something that was going to be eternal forever. This type of relationship that would have these type of requirements upon it. No one was willing to agree to these terms. And yet in Ezekiel, he reminds them that he was. I was willing. And so we find that Yahweh himself chooses to salt Israel. He chooses to make them a new creation, to purify them. He agrees to suffer death rather than allow them to stay in the state they're in. He chooses to become the object of the curses so that his voice can speak to her again. He chooses to give them life. And so we find here that this becomes the solution to the enigma. Remember that enigma, that riddle? How can one that's unfit, how can one that's uninnocent, she's not pure, she's not holy, how can she be the bride? How can she be the Isha? How can she be the one that you're going to make yourself one with? And the answer is, she's not the same woman anymore. The Israel that came out of Egypt was not the Israel that he met at the mountain. The Israel that came out of Egypt was not the same ones that entered into the promised land. The same tribes and group of individuals that were scattered to the four corners because we wouldn't keep the terms of the covenant is not going to be the same people that are brought back. You're a new creation. You've been changed. 2 Corinthians chapter 5 verse 17 says it this way. There if any man be in Messiah, he's a new creature. Old things are passed away. Behold, all things are become new. The interesting thing here is that in the Greek, this word for creature, it's katesis, and it means a new creature, but it's implying one that's never even been seen before. In other words, he's not just washing you up a little and yet, oh, you still got a lot of those spots deep down. You've completely been purified. You've been made new. You're something that's never been seen before. But the interesting thing is that this term in the Greek, katesis, it actually stems from a rabbinical usage of a word that describes how one would convert from idolatry to keeping the Torah. Well, isn't that interesting? Because that was the whole premise here. He's willing to pay the price, but remember, it's a covenant. Both parties have an obligation. And so we find that when we choose to walk in Torah, when we choose to walk in covenant with the Messiah, that's when you get to become this new creation. That's when the change takes place. That's when the mindset changes and you're no longer in bondage. You're no longer the captive woman. Outside of Torah, we don't have any rights. We don't have this covenant. We're stuck in bondage. But when we choose to ratify it, when we choose to bring the salt, to enter into this covenant, you're no longer who you were before. You've now been changed. Now let's continue a little bit to look a little bit closer into this parsha. In Deuteronomy 21 verse 11, there's some other things that she's told of the process that it's going to take for her to be redeemed. In verse 11 he says that when they see a beautiful woman and you have a desire unto her, that thou wouldst have her to thy wife. Well, I decided to look at that word desire. In Hebrew it's the word kashak, and it means to love, to be attached to long for. But the interesting thing, because remember, the premise here is that this deals with Israel. This is Israel. This is who she is. She's this captive woman. Well, this word kashak is also used in Deuteronomy 7:7, and it describes how Yahweh would set his love on Israel. It's the same word used right here of how the individual would set their love on this captive woman. And in connection when this statement is made that he has set his love upon Israel, if you continue to read down into verse 11, we're told then that because he has set his love upon them, what their response should be. The proper way to respond to the fact that he's chosen them. The proper way to respond to the fact that he's choosing to redeem them. And in verse 11 it says, Thou shalt therefore keep the commandments and the statutes and the judgments which I command thee this day to do them. Can you see? It's the same picture over and over again. Israel's being given these commandments, these mitzvot, because it's the proper response, because of the fact that he's chosen to set his love upon them. Yeshua made the same statement, if you love me, keep my commandments. Let's look a little bit farther. She's told then after that if they bring her and they choose her, that they'll bring her home to their house, and she shall shave her head and pare her nails. Well, let's look at this a little bit further. From the surface, we understand that this was a ritual that was taking place. It was part of her process, but there's a spiritual connotation here. Let's look at this word for shave. In the Hebrew, it's the word galak, and it means to poll, to shave off, or to be bald, but it's a word that's connected with the counting process. To poll, to count, to be counted, a census that's taking place. This is what's taking place here. He's beginning to count those that are going to be in covenant, those that would be numbered among Israel. The root of this word galak is the gamel lamed. It's Strong's number 1530, and it can mean a heap or a pile of rocks. And whenever you would see a heap of rocks, it would indicate that a covenant was being ratified and agreed to. A covenant's being entered into. It's the same thing that was symbolized here when the woman agreed to do this. She shaves her head. It held the same symbolic meaning of this pile of rocks being piled up. A covenant was being ratified. A covenant's being entered into. Another meaning of this gamel lamed root, it can mean a wave, a billow, a spring. It indicates the bride as a barred spring, a spring that's sealed up. It describes her chastity. In other words, she goes from one that's been the harlot, one that's unfaithful, impure, to one that's now a chaste virgin, a virgin. She goes from one that's been all over. She's been in Egypt, she's been in Babylon, she's been in all these other nations, to one that's now a spring sealed up, one that's ready and waiting because of what this covenant would change in her life. The numerical value of this word for shave, galak, it equals 41. It's the same value as the Hebrew word lavah, which means to join, to be joined to, as in a husband being joined to his wife. And so we find that when the captive woman would shave her head, it was symbolic of this covenant being ratified and accepted. A covenant that would take her, it would transform her. She'd be that new creature, that new creation. A spring sealed up the virtuous woman. And we find that all of this was in preparation for her being able to be joined, made one with her husband. Because remember the enigma, remember the riddle. She's unfit. How can you take her? He can take her because of the covenant. It's changed her. She's no longer who she was before. And whenever you look at this, you have to understand, with her head being shaved, it once again calls our attention to what hair was symbolic of in the scriptures, in the Torah. It symbolized a covering. So when she shaves her head, It was symbolic of her showing her willingness to remove her former covering, to come out from under whatever before had dictated to her, whosever authority she was under before this. She now removes it, and she now acknowledges the fact that she's under a new covering. She's under a new covenant. She's got another husband. And it's amazing because it's beginning to remind us and paint the picture that if you and I want to be set free, this is still part of the process. We can't keep one foot in Egypt and try to put one foot over here in the Torah and think that we can do both and that we'll be that new creature. And think that we can ratify this covenant and walk it out and be the bride when we still got a foot in Egypt. It requires you to remove that covering. It requires you to come out. You can't be free when you're still in Egypt. No matter what you may think, no matter what lies the enemy may have sold you, as long as you're in Egypt, you're a slave. You may got a lot of wealth there. You may have a lot of things going for you. You may have a position and friends and all of these things, but you're still a slave until you come out of Egypt. The next thing is that she was told to pare her nails. In Hebrew, it's the word asah, and it means to do, to fashion, to accomplish, to make, but it can also mean to repair. It's spelled with the ayin, the sheen, and the hay. The ayin means to see, to know, to understand something. It's attached to the sheen hay, which forms the word say, which means lamb. In other words, as she's going through this process, and she's removing her previous covering and everything that she's known before, he's causing her to see, to know, and to understand that her new covering that's being offered to her, it's coming via the lamb. The one that's going to cause her to be repaired. This is who she's now under. This is her new covering now. And the amazing thing is that if we tie this whole process back into the salt covenant, the word malak, or salt, throughout the scriptures, you'll find that it's often connected with the dead or the salt sea. That's what it immediately connects you to, the salt sea. Well, it's no accident that today, the Dead Sea, the Salt Sea, is a body of water that for all intents and purposes, it's dead. It's not living. Well, did you know that there's prophecies concerning this body of water that say that it's going to live again? It's going to be made fresh again. It's going to be renewed, repaired. Zechariah chapter 14 verse 8 tells us, "And it shall be in that day that living waters shall go out from Jerusalem, half of them toward the former sea, and half of them toward the hinder sea in summer, and in winter shall it be." It's a powerful shadow picture. That which is dead is going to live again. In fact, if we look, we find that this particular body of water, it's associated, when you begin to look at it on a physical map, you'll find that the Jordan River flows down into the Dead Sea. The Jordan River is the river of judgment. It's the river that you got to cross to get into the Promised Land. The Promised Land represented the house of Yahweh, His exalted dwelling place, the one that the bride was supposed to come into to dwell in unity with her husband in intimacy. If you were unable to cross the Jordan River, though, if you were unable to cross through His judgment, guess what happened? You're cut off and you flow down to the Dead Sea, the lowest place on earth. It was a picture of being cut off, of being unable to be redeemed, unable to come back. And so we find then that for some time it seems that the bride herself, we've been there. We've been in the Dead Sea. We've been cut off. We've been at a point where it seems that there's no life. At a point where it seems that there's nothing left. There's nothing. Ezekiel saw it as a valley of dry bones. No life, no wind, no spirit. And yet we find that the prophecy is there that the Dead Sea is going to live again. And we find that if we're willing to enter into this salt covenant, it's forever. And Yahweh's promise that He'll put His word into that which was dead. It will live again. One day, living waters will flow. That's a very powerful shadow picture for you and I. The ones that have been cut off, the ones that have been dead, the ones that for all intents and purposes haven't been flowing in His Spirit, haven't been living in this covenant terms that would allow us to be free, redeemed out of bondage. And yet He's reminding you, you may have been down in the Dead Sea, you may have been cut off, but you're going to live again. In fact, as we get ready to close, this is the very picture that's seen in these fall festivals that we're quickly approaching. Right now we're in the 6th month the month of Elul. It's a time of repentance, a time of teshuvah, self-reflection. And by teshuvah, it doesn't just mean that you say, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that, and then after Yom Kippur you go right back and do it again. It means that you turn from the thing that you're doing, the sin that you're involved in, you turn your back on it, and you head back towards the covenant. You return to what was right. And so we find that as we look at these fall festivals, it's all about this captive woman. She's being transformed. She's being prepared for the wedding ceremonies. Yom Kippur was the wedding mikvah. Sukkot is the wedding celebration. In fact, if you look at the word Elul, the 6th month before these fall festivals, we're right now in the month of Elul. It's translated as meaning nothingness, something that's worthless, ineffective. To be quite honest, that's been a very apt description of us in the past. But yet, these same letters, Aleph, Lamed, Vav, Lamed, they form an acronym for the phrase, Ani le Dodi, Be Dodi li. Songs chapter 6, verse 3. I am my beloved's, and my beloved is mine. The one that was worthless gets to become the one that's beloved, if she'll follow the terms that have been laid out. There's a prescription for what ails us. All we've got to do is be willing to dig it out and actually do it. We hope that you have enjoyed the teaching today and that maybe you look at this a little bit differently. Instead of being something that's antiquated and done away with, now we can see the significance. Now we understand it's all part of our redemption process. Amen? Amen.